Welcome to the Institute for Policy Studies for our event this evening on pluriversal knowledge and the polycrisis, the planetary polycrisis. First, I'll start with a few words about the Institute for Policy Studies. We are a multi-issue progressive policy think tank that was founded in the early 1960s. And we do work spanning a wide range of issue areas from foreign policy and militarism to economic justice to climate and environmental justice. And my name is Basav Sen. I direct the climate policy program at IPS. And a few quick logistical points. Please no use of electronic devices during the event for people who are here in person. And our restrooms are right that way, and they are both gender neutral. And for people joining online, thanks for joining. And we'll have our guest speaker, Dr. Madhulika Banerjee, speak, and then I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get the discussion started. And after that, we'll open up the floor for questions and answers. And people who are on the Zoom, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions. And with that, let's get started. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Madhulika Banerjee. She's a professor in the political science department at the University of Delhi. She published a book called Power, Knowledge, Medicine, Ayurvedic Pharmaceuticals at Home and in the World in 2009, and has written extensively on Ayurveda since then, both in peer-reviewed journals and in the popular media. And she's been on fellowships at different institutions overseas, most recently at the New Institute in Hamburg, Germany. And she's active in international academic collaborative projects with colleagues from France and Brazil. And she's also published the Herbal Sutra, a book of Indian herbs for contemporary users in 2023. She has watched and learned from those involved with active politics on the ground, mainly in social movements, believing that knowledge should be co-produced with those in practice. Her current focus is on how the experience of pluriversal knowledges with modernity offers a fresh framework for responses to the climate crisis. And just a few introductory words here from me, and then I'll pass it on to you. Clearly, we see today that the world is facing several overlapping crises. And because they're overlapping, they're referred to as polycrisis, because at the same time, we have impending climate catastrophe. We have severe biodiversity loss. We have our oceans getting acidified. And at the same time, we have incredible wealth and growing poverty, and a widening gap between the wealthy and the poor worldwide, reaching the point of almost like oligarchic concentrations of wealth. And at the same time, we have the rise of authoritarian governments in many parts of the world. And clearly, our current dominant models of thinking aren't measuring up and aren't addressing the crisis. To give you one small example, some genius thought up the idea of carbon offsets where a company can pollute and can pay someone else to preserve a forest to somehow draw down that pollution. It has made a number of traders very rich in trading carbon offsets, but it hasn't actually solved the problem of emissions. So clearly, we need new ideas, and some of those new ideas are actually very well established ideas in communities, indigenous communities, farming communities, etc., worldwide. And that's what we are going to hear about today from Dr. Banerjee. So, on to you.
Thank you so much, Asaf. Am I clear? Can you hear me clearly, especially since I'm using the mic? Or only for that? So I just wanted to confirm that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for this invitation to speak here. And um, it's not common for me to be able to come and share my ideas in this part of the world, and especially because these are ideas that need to be shared and talked about. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you. Um, I will uh, go straight into the content of my talk, and then we can do questions. You'll need to tell me how long I have to speak.
It's an hour and a half event, so you can take 20 minutes, even half an hour if you need to. That will still leave plenty of time for Q&A.
Okay. I might, okay. I might have more than that, but if you like, then yeah, should
Yeah, 40 minutes should be
40
fine.
minutes, fine. Good, good. Then I will go with that. Okay. So, as you said, it's now widely recognized that the urgent responses required by the planetary polycrisis could well come from pluriversal knowledges. This is because their epistemologies focus on the balance between humans and nature and rooted in local ecologies. Their practices foster interdependent, sustainable relations of production between humans and nature. And that's why I say that this balancing the cognitive and the material is that the cognitive manifests in the material, such that the cycles of production and regeneration in nature determine that of production by humans. The epistemology also governs patterns of consumption and distribution, allowing for the possibility of balance overall. This set them distinctly apart from, and in terms of sustainability, superior to capitalist systems of production, and so they offer a framework of an alternative to that. I want to also offer a quick additional background as to why this perspective is important. Because there is now a narrative on Indian knowledge systems in India, that which is the hegemonic narrative, and that narrative is, um, constructed in terms of recovering the glory of Indian knowledge systems as they have been available, and that narrative talks about Indian knowledge systems as if they belong to the past. And they are indicative of a forgotten glory that preempts science and scientific discovery, needs recovery. This is the dominant narrative. So while there is no doubt that rich knowledge exists in Indian knowledge systems, available in texts and commentaries, I argue for a shift in looking at a very different aspect of these systems, which lives on in the everyday practices of different kinds of production, not just in texts of the past. These practices have been adaptive and resilient and are the richer for it. This is the aspect that needs to be studied for the contemporary. So I want to state right at the beginning, I don't call them Indian knowledge systems. I call them pluriversal knowledges, and I'll, talk about that later. But then, more importantly, that I'm talking about the contemporary, the present, and not the past. I believe that Indian knowledge systems weave theory and practice together in a dynamic process of engagement and transformation. Thus, IKS, as they are known back home, is embodied knowledge. So, practice is a deep manifestation of the epistemology. It is further an umbrella term for ecologically embedded practices, such that the material basis of practice is linked to specific ecologies, which provide the natural resources for the practice of that knowledge system. And given that within any circumscribed space of a nation state, there is great ecological plurality. So, plurality is at the heart of these knowledges, while there is a shared circle of epistemology. This shared epistemological basis is in the fundamental relationships that human beings have with nature, of nurturing, of interdependence, and the long term. And these three provide an epistemological matrix for how radically different an economy of production rooted in ecology would look like. So, this makes it possible to argue that these knowledge systems offer an existing framework of sustainable production relevant to the contemporary. So, I will bring for this discussion a distinctive framework that I developed over the last 3 decades, a framework that critically engages with these knowledge systems by studying them from the material aspect of the production systems. These production systems, as I have said, embodied a specific epistemology in their practice, produced thriving industries of produce that had attracted merchants from all over the world, of whom Europeans came in the 18th century or so. This part of the story is well known. And also that the producers in India first benefited by the trade, and then when mercantile capitalism combined with colonialism, they were marginalized almost to the point of destruction. They were not totally destroyed, however. It is interesting how they survived in the last 200 years or so through the colonial period to the post colonial, engaging with industrial systems of production and capitalist systems of exchange to adapt so as to be able to survive and also thrive. Capitalist systems that entered the ecologies where these knowledge systems had been in practice disrupted them significantly. And from that, two patterns emerge. The first, when these systems sought to mimic both the processes, trying to be their double, trying to mimic the capitalist processes of production, trying to be their double. And the second kind of pattern that emerged was when they sought to adapt by adopting some of the aspects of the new systems, but struggled to retain their distinctiveness and remain the other. So you have two responses of trying to be the double of capitalist systems and trying to remain the other while engaging with them. Studying these patterns, I believe, gives us a clue not just of how they responded historically, but the possibility of how they can be relevant to the contemporary and indeed the future. This, I expect, creates a very different narrative to that which is currently hegemonic. It focuses on the contemporary, not the past, on the material, not just the textual, and most importantly, foregrounding the potential of innately sustainable practices of production in these systems that have the potential to prefer the alternatives we are so desperately seeking today. This paper, based on the study of specific initiatives in India, will explore in some depth the second of the two above, that of remaining the other. It will examine how this response faced two challenges. One is external, from the capitalist systems of production, consumption, and distribution, which are challenges of standardization, creation of new commodities, and scale, very important issue. The other challenge is internal, of deep social and economic hierarchies, like caste and gender, that are endemic to the societies in which these knowledge systems are practiced. Yet they have recognized that retaining the distinctive epistemology of the other need not necessitate retaining these hierarchies and inequalities. So they have explored paths that include democratization of these practices. And this paper argues that together the pathways generated in response to these knowledges offer more equitable and just responses to the polycrisis. So, the three examples I've brought for discussion are those of production stemming from medical knowledge and developments within Ayurveda. Everybody knows about Ayurveda now. It's a medical knowledge system from India, which has gained a lot of traction in the last 20 years globally. A second example will be an intervention in the craft sector. And the third will be the story of one tribal village community that has created a better life for themselves using the knowledge they had. Um, I'd like to say that I've chosen these examples as representative examples. These are not isolated examples. They're representative of many like commodity interventions that have come up in the last 40, 50, 70 years since in the post-colonial period, particularly. Now, in this, I have a great many things to share, so I will see how many I can. So, in the space of Ayurveda, there are three aspects that are important. One is the development of the Ayurvedic pharmaceutical industry in the last 100 years or so. The second is the development of a randomized clinical trial on the basis of the principles of Ayurveda. And the third is the work of local health practitioners in different parts of the country. Now, the Ayurvedic pharmaceutical industry, which grew during the colonial period, they emulated in many ways. They tried to be the double of the biomedical industry as it developed along with the colonial state, and they identified those medicines that could be made for off the shelf, over the counter, sort of access for the rapidly growing urban centers, and um, they created a system of mass manufacture of Ayurvedic medicines, which never existed before. Now, I've discussed this in detail in the book that you refer to, the Ayurveda book. But what has happened in in the years since I even published the book is that while Ayurvedas and these pharmaceutical companies, particular, they are not generalizable to what is happening in the entire Ayurveda sector, but this is a very important marker. These companies, while they tried to mimic the biomedical companies, they tried very hard to retain uh, and to be the other of biomedicine, which they are in many foundational ways. So, but when it comes to an economic competition, then it becomes very difficult for them to survive. And then they have to position themselves as closely as the double of biomedicine if they are able to, if they are supposed to remain in the market. So it showed that it could make mass production of medicines. It could emulate the new distribution systems. It the pricing, the positioning, very interesting stories about how they position the medicines in the market and so on. They tried all of these things, so it's a very interesting set of practices by which they go between trying to be the double and the other of a biomedicine, in which one of the very important outcomes has been that mass manufacture of Ayurvedic medicines means accessing a great deal of um, raw materials from the wild for the manufacture of these medicines. And this access of raw materials has actually systematically contributed to the denuding of biodiversity, which is at the heart of the making of Ayurvedic medicine. So they have actually created a dilemma of a huge environmental loss while they are supposed to be the medical knowledge system that actually caters to the natural, to the holistic, and so on. So, this is a very interesting experience of creating a modern Ayurvedic pharmaceutical industry, which then begs the question as to whether Ayurveda can be cast into this modern capitalist frame. Clearly, it has many, many downsides, and in that sense, replicates the problems of capitalist production. while at the same time, when you see multiple locations of Ayurvedic medicines being produced and used, in which the foundational principle of many of these knowledge systems is that you produce on the basis of the local and you produce it for the local. So mass production is something that is antithetical to the deeply sustainable epistemology of these knowledge systems. So here is the, sort of contradiction in terms. And so something that is natural or holistic in its by description, by its epistemology, when it's cast into the capitalist system of production, can become completely antithetical to its own epistemology. This is the point that the experience of Ayurvedic industry is showing. So that's one kind of experience. The other is when Ayurveda has been um, constantly derided for it lacking an evidence base. That what is the evidence base? How do you produce evidence for Ayurveda? And throughout the last 70, 80 years, all kinds of scientific work on Ayurveda has happened. And uh, on that, I can talk separately for an hour as to what the debates were and what the issues. But what I want to bring here for discussion today is a very important randomized clinical trial conducted on Ayurvedic regimens for rheumatoid arthritis was conducted in order to actually establish the idea that evidence can be generated for Ayurveda. And it is according to the parameters that biomedicine and biomedical research can understand and accept. Because the framework of legitimacy is provided by hegemonic biomedicine. Uh, but this was done without, without conforming entirely to the protocols of the biomedical RCTs, but creating a protocol by itself. It's a fascinating. I've written about it in an article. Um, and this is when most people would think, or believed, articulated whether they were biomedical scientists or whether they were anthropologists who studied Ayurveda, would say such a thing is not possible. Even until the late, early 2000s, this was the belief. But it's by 2010, this Ayurvedic doctor in Kerala actually devises this trial, persuades the National Institutes of Health right here in Bethesda, and says that let's do a trial together. For rheumatoid arthritis, let's look at what you've got, methotrexate. We've got a whole regimen. Let's compare. And methotrexate trials take 6 weeks. They said we want 6 months because we don't claim to treat rheumatoid arthritis in 6 weeks. So we will need 6 months. But let us compare and see what we are doing, what you're doing. Now, this is a landmark, trial, which actually demonstrates that this kind of conversation between different knowledge systems is possible, but that at the end of it, that these knowledge systems show that what they have on offer is not some very obtuse kind of epistemology, but something that is materially grounded, and that the cognitive value of Ayurveda is something that can plays out very systematically, materially. It can be mapped. It can be cast into an evidence framework, which actually becomes very valuable to see whether it can be implemented on the ground or not. And the point is that this is exactly the kind of Ayurvedic practice in many ways, some aspects which continue to be practiced today in many parts of India, many parts of South Asia, I would say. So there is, the doubt that has been portrayed for a very long time as to whether these are credible knowledge systems. That doubt has been systematically, sort of dealt with, and very solid responses with communications that have come up. And the third, which I would like to talk about, but maybe for sake of time, I might not go into the detail. But the interesting thing about knowledge, these pluriversal knowledge systems and Indian knowledge systems, is that they are not uh, monolithic.
Mm.
They are so diverse, and diversity always brings hierarchy. So within these knowledge systems also there are hierarchies, and one must not be afraid to point out that this is the case. As a student of politics, it's very important for me to identify that there are hierarchies within these knowledge systems as well. And there the hierarchies are between those who are trained in the textual traditions and those who are trained in the oral traditions, broadly speaking. Not always. And the interesting thing is that those who are trained in the textual traditions are also trained orally. So there are those nuances, but we won't get into all of that just now. The interesting thing is in the post colonial period, when Ayurveda, the textual tradition, got recognition institutionally, and modern degrees in Ayurveda and so on were being granted by governments in India, they then decided that those who did not have either the traditional Gurukul education in Ayurveda or the modern Ayurvedic degrees, but practiced some kind of medical knowledge which they had got orally from some teacher somewhere, are not, they decided that, so the institutionally certified veds decided that the others are quacks. So see how interesting the hierarchies work. So the story that I want to share, but if there are questions I'll do that, is of how such local health practitioners who actually offer very important primary health care in many parts of the country, and very solid primary health care, uh, actually fought back this accusation of being quacks, which is not just a nomenclatural of accusation. It was, they were being hounded by the police. They were being told not to practice. There was violence against them. So they fought back. And it's a very interesting contestation in that space within the knowledge systems, where Indian knowledge systems, where there's a contestation of the hierarchies, and there is the debate between the cognitive and the material, which has very important lessons for fighting the polycrisis today. And just one sentence to refer to what that might be, which is that these local health practitioners are precisely that. They are local health practitioners. They base their health medical knowledge and the support that they give to communities on the basis of the local ecology where they come from. And they are able to treat basic, sort of primary healthcare needs. They are able to relate to those. And the local people have a tradition of trusting them. And interestingly, over the years, neither patients nor healers nor doctors remain the same. So patients have also developed a kind of classification that there would be primary healthcare needs for which they would go to these veds. But when there is a complication, both the ved and the patient would feel that they need to go to a doctor. So, but the point is that in India's huge healthcare system, where the primary healthcare system is the most neglected, actually, that's where these people are offering a very important service. And the whole battle is to recognize that in this kind of inequity of healthcare, these are people who are offering something that is local, which is not of immense cost, which does not burden the state, and yet it works within the framework of the ecological and the economic. That's something that is very, very valuable that comes from them. I suppose I can. This is for me? Okay, thanks. Um, I'd said that I would talk about three different aspects of pluriversal knowledges. So the second one that I want to talk about is from the craft sector in India. And there are hordes of initiatives on the craft sector, which actually try to bring what I said in the beginning, the three axes uh, into a framework, which is epistemology, ecology, and economy. And 200 million artisans is one such initiative. And I'm talking of them again as representative of this idea. And they are working to champion the India's artisan economy. And the idea is that it's a 200 million strong community. that employs only next to the agricultural sector. And the point is that this is a community that has immense knowledge about producing a whole range of things that can actually run the everyday lives of people even today. And of course, I'm not talking about cell phones and computers. Those sectors are, but every day. So from food, clothing, shelter, building, water, all kinds of things. The knowledge that these people have carried for a very long time are there. And the point is that these are people whose work, their knowledge is something that is carried by communities. It's work with hands, and it establishes that this kind of knowledge, which seeks to bring head, hand, and heart together, are the knowledges that work again with local ecologies. And they can produce for markets that are quite large if supported by the best kind of contemporary financial and business investment practices. Then they can actually be a very, very important part of the viable part of the economy, which, in any case, as they exist today, contribute significantly to India's GDP, except that because they are also the informal sector of the economy, they don't actually count. The development economists don't count the informal economy. But the interesting thing is Barbara Harris White, who's one of the most outstanding economists on India. Barbara Harris White is an Oxford economist, but who works more like an anthropologist. And for 40 years, she's been traveling around in India, knows the ground very well. Barbara Harris White actually argues that the informal economy in India is the real Indian economy because it's about 80% of India's economy. And um, uh, I'll come back to this discussion afterwards. But 200 million artisans is run by a bunch of, actually, many women who've been in the mainstream finance sector and investment banking sector of India. And they have come together to create a new model by which this so-called informal economy is worked with by different forms of capital. And so they are making these pluriversal knowledges viable, which is something that has always been an issue as long as I have known it. I'll come back to this discussion in a second. But let me also tell you the story of the third story, which I'm using to illustrate my argument. This is about another organization that is run by the Kurumba tribe of the Nilgiris. It's called the Adimalai Parangudiniyar Producer Company, which began as a farmer producer company many years ago, but has now, and the Kurumba tribe is what is classified by the government of India as a particularly vulnerable tribal group. And they registered, as I said, initially as a farm producer company, as a farmers collective, but then realized that they have knowledge to produce so many different kinds of things. If we were to bring that together and work towards trying to get better prices for the kinds of things they produce, try to understand what the market wants, produce accordingly, etc., then they would be able to get a much better life for themselves. The interesting thing is that in this producer company, 90% of the employees are tribal women. They are also shareholders. They are also part of the board of directors. So they decide the direction of the company. They decide what products are going to be brought in. And interestingly, they decide where to draw the line, which is the most important thing that modern structures, institutions of production don't know. Because in order to increase your profit margin, you continuously grow. So growth is about growing the profit. But these are companies that say, when we are comfortable, we stop. We don't need to grow anymore. because that will put strain on the forest, that will put strain on the other natural resources we have. So we draw the line, and that's fine. And the community decides as a whole that we have enough. And that's, I think, where you are creating. So uh, so therefore what they are doing is matching economic and ecological sustainability. And this is possible only when the economic ecosystem is creatively reimagined. This is what I have learned from these uh, organizations on the ground. So it's fascinating how um, you can see the value of these organizations. I don't know how far I you would like me to go into the more academic analytical discussions. I don't know how long I've been speaking. Um, about half an hour already. Yeah. So okay. So then I'll just refer to some of the points of discussion which I think are particularly significant for this. Um, so I was saying that the 200 million artisans, for instance, they are creating an economic ecosystem. This reimagination. They are talking now about something that they call catalytic capital. Catalytic capital, as opposed to venture capital or to any other traditional forms of capital, they argue is capital that needs to recognize that the manner in which the investment in these informal structures are possible, those informal structures have to be allowed that space of informality in which they work, which is in terms of their creativity, in terms of the functions of production, the fact that they are handmade, they work with their hands, and so on and so forth. But the downside of the informal, where there is no protection, there's no social protection, there's no health benefits, and so on and so forth, those need to be managed, implies that this invested capital will not grow in the same way as other investments of capital. So anyone investing in this sector will have to recognize that the growth of capital will have to be in a different trajectory. And they work very closely because they've created, it's very, very systematically done work. They've produced 2 reports by studying this entire creative and handmade sector very systematically, and they are able to project how much capital invested in what way would give what kinds of return, so that people know it's not some kind of an unknown entity, but it's a very differently known entity, and that will need to be worked on and accordingly. So they are creating what they call the new formal, a new formal which retains a lot of the creative energy of the old informal and brings in the fresh protection and support that the formal sector provides. And so because you see what happens often is that when the informal sector is brought into the formal, they simply have to cast themselves completely into the tyranny of the formal, the parameters of the formal, where only certain kinds of products will sell. They have to be sold in a certain number. You have to produce a certain number, and so on, which totally compromise the sustainable part of that production. So they are creating. So these women who know the formal sector very well and who have completely committed themselves to enabling the sustainable growth and development of the informal creative sector, but do not want it to be completely appropriated by the formal, are trying to create a completely different space. So this informality to formal, to the new formal, enables these pluriversal knowledges to function according to their core competence, their core orientation of commitment to sustainability, along with creating a kind of dignified a response of from the market that allows them to remain dignified and some kind of a dignified existence. So what I'm trying to say is that unless all the initiatives that I find on the ground that make the most amount of sense in terms of the contemporary and the future are those that actually constantly keep the balance between the epistemology of these knowledge systems and the ecology and the economy. Um, and this, interestingly, in India, the informal sector of the economy is being studied also by certain economists, very heterodox economists, of course, in a very different way. And Kalyan Sanyal, whose book Rethinking Capitalist Development came in 2007, and that is being taken forward by other economists in trying to understand how this sector, the informal sector of this, so what is known by development economists or by the formal economists as the informal sector, actually contribute to the creation of capital in an and in that invisible space that they occupy is actually a very important space, and that it allows them to create conditions for a counter hegemonic subject production. So, this counter hegemonic possibility is what makes pluriversal knowledges so very exciting. Um, so this is what I find that 200 million artisans and so on are doing, and they actually are saying that this is the way in which the catalytic capital and so on are where catalytic capital is investment capital that is patient, that is risk tolerant, that's concessionary, and flexible in ways that conventional capital is not, that it's going to create a case for the artisan economy. Now, I don't look at the artisan economy, I don't like to use the word artisan simply because the artisan economy is seen as people who are skilled and who do clever things with their hands. But I think that artisans are knowledge carriers. They need to be seen as carriers of knowledge in the same way as engineers and so on. I don't like to make these parallels, but in terms of just explaining how they are located vis a vis the hegemonic, I feel that it's important to say that they are knowledge carriers because when a person weaves a cloth, the weaver knows what cotton gives the kind of length of yarn that she can weave on a particular loom, which will enable a certain kind of fabric.
Mhm.
The weaver also understands what kind of color will come from different kinds of sources in nature, how it can be retained, or how do you create deep knowledge about making dyes, as or anyone who has ever worked with that would know that dye making is a very complex knowledge system, and so on and so forth. So all of these people actually carry this knowledge, this very deep knowledge, which they learn by doing, and this is embodied knowledge. They carry it from their hands, from their senses. And so it seems as if it's a craft, it's something that they do with their hands, but it's a whole ecosystem of learning which they are carrying with themselves. And so I believe that the kind of work we do with pluriversal knowledges is actually revitalizing a completely different knowledge economy. The phrase knowledge economy has come to typify the modern information system and modern knowledge systems, and so from the 1990s, when I was already, a professional adult, I began to hear that, oh, so now India is going to become a knowledge economy. Seriously? I mean, an economy, a country that has run such an old civilization had no knowledge. So we are now discovering knowledge afresh. Of course, there's new knowledge always, no question. And that is the dynamism of every society. And all new knowledge is to be welcomed. No question about that either. But it is a bit of a travesty to say
Mhm.
that a civilization that has produced so much, cannot be recognized as a knowledge economy. And I think that what it does as a student of politics too, for me, it's very important because this knowledge economy, understanding them as a knowledge economy, completely transforms a whole population from being the victims of poverty to agents of change.
Mm-hmm.
You are talking about a whole host of people as poor, as if their poverty is a marker of what they they don't know what to do. It's not true. The reason why they have become poor, or they are poor at this point of time, are of a different political economic order. That's a different story. But to recognize what they know as something that they can work with, and that belongs to the contemporary as well as to the future, in as much as it did belong to them in the past, is a significant ascription of agency to hordes of communities who can then become participants in creating a different kind of future. I think that that's very, very important. And I think it's not a coincidence that I'm just coming from spent the afternoon at the Museum of the African American History and Culture. And what I found absolutely amazing about that museum is that African Americans, even while slavery, torture, civil rights inequalities, and so on were discussed, African Americans are seen as agents of change, contributing to the idea of American democracy and of creating a new nation that was just and equitable and democratic. So, understanding the agency
Mm-hmm.
in hitherto, you know, in populations hitherto viewed as victims of poverty or colonialism or whatever, is very important, which is not to deny the problems
Mm-hmm.
of colonialism or imperialism, or for that matter, post-colonial inequalities perpetuated by the development narrative that the post-colonial state was so enamored of. No question, one has to state those as well. But I think for now, I think we need a shift to see the knowledge that is implicit in these economies, which have a very real relevance for the contemporary, which is very, very important, and which I think has enormous potential for the future. And by way of conclusion, I do want to say that um, in the practice of these knowledge systems, two very sharp and deep inequalities have been evident for a very long period of time. One is the inequalities of caste, the other are the inequalities of gender. Even in the practice of these knowledge systems, you know, those who work with leather, because they work with the hide of dead animals, are lower in the caste order, and they are untouchable by others. And then there are the potters and the weavers and the blacksmiths and all the others who are the real active producers in the for the economy, in the economy, all kinds, farmers and so on and so forth. And who Kancha Ilaiah says that, you know, it's because of them that the entire economy runs. But they are all, in the modern constitutional parlance, either scheduled caste or other backward communities. Now, why, what has made them backward is not the knowledge, it's just what the credence that their knowledge has been given in the modern economy. So these inequalities need to be addressed. And the most heartening part of interventions of the last 30, 40 years in these various sectors with the very many that have worked with these knowledges is that wherever there are interventions, the interventions are very conscious of these, both of these inequalities, that caste inequality has to be taken on head on, and gender inequality, and that many of these modern organizations have equal or more participation by women, and recognize that caste inequalities are something that have to be absolutely questioned, done away with, and uh, that these knowledge carriers who carry knowledges as part of their traditional community identities, no doubt, but have to be participant in the modern process as democratic constitutional subjects.
Mhm.
So, this is the most interesting and heartening thing. And this is possibly the one space in which the three things are coming together: the fact that they're knowledge carriers, the fact that they're constitutional subjects, and the fact that they look to the future. So, I think that the tragic part is that actually this is a very large space, I know, in India. But because it is diffused, because they are usually of necessity locally constituted, and therefore, and there is no political sutra that binds them so far. Not in the political mainstream, not in the political opposition, are people really aware of the huge political potential of this arena. That is why they are less known, and that is why the potential they have is not translating in terms of creating a fresh political agenda for the future. But that possibility exists on the ground. And that is something that we therefore need to look at and very, very systematically incorporate in a fresh political alternative set of ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madhulika. That was fascinating and very eye-opening. And I have a lot of questions in my head, actually, but I will confine myself to uh, relatively few of them, just given time constraints and, for opportunity for everyone to ask questions. But to start with, I would love to learn about the term pluriversal knowledges, which from my previous conversation with you uh, is the preferred term by practitioners in the field today. And it describes knowledge systems that, in a lot of the more mainstream discourse today, is talked about as traditional ecological knowledge. I would love to hear from you why practitioners prefer the term pluriversal knowledges and what are some of the drawbacks of the framing of traditional ecological knowledge.
Sure. I mean, that really should be where we should start. Um, I think for a very long time, calling these knowledges traditional ecological has been not even traditional ecological. In India, it has been mostly traditional knowledges. The difficulty with that framing is because of the word tradition in English. It means something that is constituted by and in the past,
Mhm.
and it is seen as something that is congealed in the past.
Mhm.
The difficulty of the word tradition, the way it is used particularly, is that it is not seen as something that moves, that changes. It is something that remains static.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the knowledges that it is used to describe are anything but that. Of course, they must have been constituted a very long time ago. But I think we should have a foundational respect for human ingenuity, that no knowledge system that is created even 3,000 years ago is going to remain static.
Mhm.
That's simply not possible. According to changing times, requirements, ecologies, environments, spaces, human beings work with the knowledges they inherit, transform them, adapt them, and build on them.
Mhm.
And that is true of all knowledges that that are claimed to be the great knowledges of India's past, that have come from in the hegemonic narrative likes to say that they've come from all the big say the big rishi munis of the past. The big service that the rishi munis did was to put them in texts, and that has to be acknowledged and appreciated, no question. But nobody in practice sticks only to the text. Even today, when Ayurvedic practitioners are texts, and you have a wonderful uh, anthropologist from the US, Adam Caruli, who's just written a wonderful book 2 years ago called The Practice of Texts, who shows how when you learn from the text, and it comes from learning entire texts by heart, by rote. But the system of rote learning is not about sticking to the text. You remember the text in detail, in absolute, in its fixity, only so you know that, okay, that's how it is seen. But when you see a patient, what might be described in the text would actually have to adapt to what your patient is telling you, because every patient's body is different. And that is the, and when the, even in the traditional way, when the guru would teach the disciples, and there's in Kerala it's called mukham mukham. It's the way they recite the text together. But the recitation is in the context of the day-long consultation that the guru has been having with the patients, and which the student has been observing, in which then they have a discussion about what they learned in the text, what they've seen in the patient, what can they do. And this goes into myriad adaptations and commentaries. So, if that is the understanding of traditional, it belies the understanding of tradition as something that is congealed and static. It is dynamic. So, the word traditional is problematic. Ecological is useful because it's very important, because actually all knowledges are the most efficient when they are ecological, which does not mean that there cannot be universal ideas about knowledge. Gravity is universal, and all kinds of other, modern scientific laws which have established some universalisms are very valuable. There's no question about it. But the fact is that the knowledges that people use to live by, to produce, and so on and so forth, these are knowledges which have to be adapted to the ecology where they are being practiced. And it is when you practice according to the ecology that you know that you are dependent on nature, and you owe to nature a responsibility which is at, you know, the most important responsibility is the intergenerational responsibility. So, ecology, understanding the ecology of knowledge is so important because it binds you to nature in terms of an interdependence with nature. You do not lord and master over nature. You are dependent on nature, but nature is dependent on you, so that you leave it to regenerate itself when it does. And you go with the cycles of nature, as it were. So, with these kinds of limitations, therefore, we needed a phraseology which would incorporate both the idea that, because I said plurality is very important, ecology is plural. There is nothing universal about ecology. But then there are certain, there's a kind of circle of intelligibility which is common. And pluriverse is, in a sense, opposed to the idea of the universe, but also rooted in the plurality. So, therefore, it is something that people find more conducive to explaining the kind of knowledge systems that they are dealing with. Hence.
And that brings me right to my next question, which is the whole notion of plurality, the immense diversity of these knowledge systems, the fact that they're not a monolith, versus what you described as the hegemonic view in India in particular about um, uh, knowledge systems that are, you know, um, from India or from the subcontinent. And uh, this question, or where I'm leading with this, is more broadly applicable in other parts of the world as well. Um, which is that today we are facing a growing crisis of authoritarianism, where we are today in the United States, certainly also in India.
Absolutely.
And how how in your experience have you seen uh, pluriversal knowledge systems facing challenges from an authoritarian hegemonic ideology that might want to, number one, homogenize them, number two, maybe attribute them to uh, a certain ancient glorious past that needs to be recovered without acknowledging that they are very dynamic today, as you pointed out, and also that often um, that dynamism and the practitioners of that knowledge system are the very people who uh, the hegemonic powers want to further marginalize. In the Indian context, that would be like a Hindu nationalist government uh, not wanting to acknowledge the role of knowledge that has been carried mainly by Dalits, for example. Uh, in other parts of the world, like here in the US, similarly, we have an authoritarian government that is openly white supremacist and would not want to uh, acknowledge any knowledge or expertise. And we are even seeing it manifested in a somewhat different way than it is in India. But we are very much seeing it in their arguments about what they're dismissively calling DEI, or diversity, equity, and what was the I in DEI? Inclusion. Yeah. Um, so are you seeing pluriversal knowledge systems facing this kind of challenge from authoritarian homogenization, and how, if so, how are they responding to it?
Well, the interesting thing is that, especially in terms of pluriversal knowledge systems that are related to production, um, I don't think they even yet enter into the circle of reckoning of the state yet, for two reasons. One, because it is a vast sector, and when it is primarily concerned with production, because it has for a very long time been cast in the frame of being uh, culturally powerful Indian symbols. So, handcraft, handmade in India is a cultural symbol. And that is a cultural symbol which is innately diverse, which this kind of hegemonic agenda would not have a problem with, because they do not see them as pluriversal knowledge agendas. They see them as poor artisan economies which are trying to survive, doing well. And if they do well, the colorful nature of India would be, asserted, and that's fine. They are not in any way an epistemological challenge as they see it. So they wouldn't bother. But the other reason also is that, interestingly, uh, a regime that has so much emphasis on Indian knowledge systems, because of its emphasis on the IKS being constituted in the hoary past and only in texts, that when they want it to have some kind of prominence in the contemporary, the application is not very systematic at all. Apart from setting up centers for Sanskrit studies, which I have no problem with, I think it's a very good idea. Everywhere in the world, one should study older languages, especially that carry such fabulous literature and philosophy. They should be read, and they should be read critically, as everywhere. I mean, if all the European universities have schools of Latin and Greek, I see no reason why anywhere else in the world people should not be treating the traditional languages. I don't see that as a problem, which of course the conventional left in India, in its great wisdom, has no position on understanding this at all. They just oppose it because it's Sanskrit. I mean, I don't understand that either. So I have no sympathy with it, as you can imagine. So, but the problem is Center for Sanskrit Studies is not going to offer, that entire world for the contemporary. You need to study the text. You need to study them critically. Though I don't think that's what the hegemonic agenda is about. But then so what? For the contemporary, the kind of application thinking, extending that idea that is required, as of now, I don't see it happening. So on the one hand, their agenda is not very clear on this. And on the other hand, the material, actual manifestation that is there on the ground, which can be built, I think, actually significantly for the future, that is not on their agenda either. You see?
Mm-hmm.
And the third, I mean, one example that I want to offer in this is that, Ayurveda. Now, you would think that it's already a hugely built up industry. For a government committed to Indian knowledge systems, this should be the flagship, right? It is, and it isn't. And you find the people who are doing the most amount of systematic work in Ayurveda, critical, analytical, scientific, rigorous work in Ayurveda, they are not the ones that are being most supported. But it is this very limited aspect of a capitalist production of Ayurveda, which is being, because that gives you markets, this gives you visibility, that gives you a kind of a symbol that you're working with. This is representative of India's great past. And amongst the manufacturers, who do they support? A person who has no credible training in Ayurveda that we know of, but has acquired great popularity for something that he probably does well, which is yoga. But he creates this pharmaceutical industry, company, which starts making Ayurvedic medicines and produces a so-called antidote to COVID without trials, without the necessary thing, which makes all the other pharmaceutical industries that I was critiquing in my work earlier, makes them look like very credible industries, actually. So I've written about, I openly opposed Coronel when it was launched during COVID. I wrote in the Indian Express against it. So, so you see, even within Ayurveda, this regime is not supporting the most interesting, uh, players in that sector either. So I'm not sure exactly what exactly. So their homogenizing, tendencies are not visible, as you rightly pointed out, is the hallmark of. So they are doing it with the Hindu identity.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing is that the practice of Hinduism in India is so fabulously diverse.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's so interestingly diverse, including traditions of Hindu practice in which women are the priests, in which women read the texts that many other traditions women are not allowed to read. I belong to one of those. I'm a practicing Hindu, and I challenge anyone to tell me that I have to be a follower of so and so, so and so. I know who I follow, whom I got. That's the great advantage of having 33 million gods. You see, you have your own, and nobody can tell you whether you're an authentic Hindu or not. We haven't come that far yet. Despite all the build-up of one icon, you know, even the worshippers of that one icon cannot tell me that that icon has to be primary in my realm of worship. So we have interesting times ahead and lots to work with to contest this kind of hegemony.
Two fascinating threads from your answer that stood out to me. One is that it seems the current state power is almost trivializing and infantilizing these knowledge systems, and thinking of them as just cute artists making little products instead of recognizing them as a knowledge system. But that has the curious side effect of they're not finding it threatening.
I mean, that's my estimation.
Yeah.
Because nothing to that effect has happened. Yeah.
But, also the other point you were making that that their attempts at homogenization, in spite of their rhetoric, has not actually translated into changing cultural practices, which to me is a huge sign of hope in terms of how to resist a hegemonic political and cultural agenda.
Sure. Except that I do want to, that's exactly the sense I wanted to convey. But I do want to, flag that I'm deeply aware that while they have not made any attempt so far to homogenize Hindu practice, othering, yes, is actively happening, and that is extremely serious and very difficult. And in the light of that othering, for Hindus like myself, so to say, I am not a Hindu that believes that othering is part of my Hinduness. That articulation, for it to come out, that is very difficult, and that's not happening yet. So that is a problem where there is that, you think we have the space and we are not being able to do it. So one must flag that inadequacy as well. Yeah.
And so with that, I do have one more question I wanted to ask, but I'll open it up to people in the audience, either here or online. Has anyone submitted a question online? No. Okay. Anyone in the room have a question?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And today, because you have used the term planetary in the title of your talk, and I am the founder of this new think tank in Washington, D.C., which is called Planetary Futures Institute. And this institute is actually focused on the planetary consciousness and planetary identity and thinking about the biggest picture conceivable. Because this idea comes back to many scholars who have been working in futures studies, foresight, anthropology, and all of them are talking about creating a new scientific paradigm, which is based on the idea of looking at the big forces of change at a very macro scale. Some of them call this epistemology, like using the term omnology, which is about looking at the overlapping or integration of different patterns across multiple large-scale changes. So my question from you is that how can we use probably the indigenous and sometimes, as you just mentioned today, the Indian knowledge systems to contribute to this vision of creating a much enriched planetization on our planet, on Earth, and make it as an alternative to globalization process, which is obviously driven by many of the hegemonic Western value system and epistemology. And just for information, I have recently published a book which is called, the title of which is Planetary Foresight and Ethics. Mm-hmm. And in that book, I have used extensively Indian knowledge systems that we mentioned today. And for example, let me just give you an example. The idea of life forces in the Ayurvedic medicine, which is called Vata, mm-hmm. coming from the mythology and looking at the forces of life, mm-hmm. the wind and the atmosphere. In that contribution, we are saying that some of this traditional knowledge can be mapped into the modern scientific terms. For example, atmosphere could be the isomorphic or mapped concept from the concept of Vayuvata in the Sanskrit and Avestan, of course, traditions. And also the other terms like geosphere or hydrosphere, which is very popular among the scientific communities today to understand the future of the planet, and of course the future of the space programs could be linked to that level of ancient or sometimes traditions, and use them for better understanding of the contemporary and the very long-term future. And of course, in that book, I'm also mapping the far future scenarios for the space and cosmic consciousness, using exactly a combination of this modern scientific terminology and those knowledge systems from the different civilization, including the Indian civilization. How do you believe that this project could be accepted among the leading universities and think tanks and other academic and research centers?
Thank you so much for that amazing question. But before I answer it, I want to know the full name of your book. Planetary Foresight and, sorry, I didn't.
Planetary Foresight and Ethics.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Yes, that would be great. You know, I see this question as a call to see whether these knowledges, which we are now, all of us, whether we've all studied in universities and formal modern knowledge systems, we are all acutely aware that these knowledges have something else. They have something very valuable to teach us. But it is not a coincidence that these knowledges remain outside the pale of universities. So I'll come to this point that you asked, the second part of your question. I'll come back to it later. The way I see it, these knowledges survive to a great extent in large parts of our societies across the world, especially across the global south, where neither the modern state nor the modern market has actually been able to give them the benefits of modernity. So these are communities that this is what they have. They have their knowledges about their soil, about their water, about their forests, about everything else. And they are trying to live by that knowledge. They are supported by people like us who have been educated in this tradition and then have stepped away, and said, okay, I think they need my confidence to be able to work, to bring capital, to bring kind of support, but ultimately my duty is to really work with them. And across the global south, you have these communities just plodding away at their own capacity. So we need to recognize that these knowledges have actually survived the neglect of the state and the market. And because, in your introduction, you mentioned that, I have learned from communities on the ground. And I was taught very early on by my teacher, my professor in the university, that if you are to understand the politics of your country, and if you are to research on questions that make a difference to what is happening to your country or to your ground, then listen to the ground. Don't look for issues in journals as to what is fashionable to research on. Look for questions from the ground, and you'll see that when you are forced to answer them, you also have to listen to what they feel and they think about it. So I have learned from them. And I find that they have, and now after 30, 35 years of this learning process and writing and whatever I've come to, now the demand from the ground, from these communities, is that, we are sick and tired of being told to prefer evidence that our knowledge works, that our knowledge is scalable, our knowledge is as sophisticated as modern knowledge systems are. We're tired of this. So now they tell me, you're a professor in the university, you know how the university knowledge system works. Can you create a framework, a set of parameters? You understand what our knowledges are about, how we work. You know that our parameters are different from theirs. Can you not help us create a set of parameters that look just as rigorous, just as solid, which reflect the value of the work we do? And we use that framework to put out all the myriad knowledge systems, people's knowledges, they call it, many of them. I like to call them they see this pluriversal and all we don't understand. This is lokavidya. Many people use this term. Lokavidya is people's knowledge. So this is lokavidya. Help us document local. So you won't believe, this is the pressure I have. 4 or 5 different very major organizations that have been working on this and who I'm close to are telling me, now this is your job. Give up your work at the university. Now do this for us. So what I'm saying is that there is a recognition, even from them, that they have nurtured this at, completely autonomously with very little of the resources that modern institutions have to present what knowledge they consider legitimate. So now they want legitimacy for their knowledges. And they want us to create those frames of legitimacy. Given that that is the case, I think that they have a lot of valuable contributions to make to what some parts of science that you are trying to access are doing. We cannot ignore that so much of science is the handmaiden of capitalism, which is hell-bent on just destroying this planet. I'm hearing of some efforts to try and put sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. What is going on? So I know that that kind of thing exists. And then there is this whole, underbelly, I would say, of knowledges which have great value. I think it's that process of legitimation that is very much required, that would enable the voice of this underbelly of knowledge systems to make a mark. Because as you and I know well, and if you are now setting up a think tank, I'm in great appreciation that you even want to take on this very difficult, difficult question. you know how difficult it is going to be to penetrate this entire, sort of institutionalized knowledge, which is hell-bent on destroying the planet. Can you imagine how anybody is going to take this seriously? Unless it's people like you and me who join hands with people who've been working on the ground to say, we are creating a different template of knowledge production. We are creating a different template of production on the ground, which actually has a claim to sustainability, and all this greenwashing is not sustainability. So I think that is the real political project of our times. And it's only if we are able to do that will answer your second question. That if we are able to create that kind of a powerful space of legitimate knowledge, that then universities will and institutions of research will begin to take it seriously. How that is going to happen? You see, let's not forget that we have the modern university as the site of knowledge production for the last 300 years, right? And it's so powerful. And there is a clear alignment between the hegemony of the university and capital and the state. So this other whole space of knowledge, for it to acquire that kind of currency in the negotiation, that's a political project that, some of us are beginning to see this as an important alignment. If we can do that. And the thing is, I hesitate to call it Western knowledge systems. They are industrial knowledge systems. And there are industrial knowledge systems that are as hegemonic in India as they are in the West. We should acknowledge that. So this is not an East-West binary anymore. I understand where you're coming from, but I just thought I should point out that I don't have this glorified notion of coming from a different kind. I know that I have allies in Europe, in North America, who are just as oppressed by this hegemonic system. You are clearly one of them. So that's very important to recognize, because this is a planetary alliance as well. This is not an alliance, and this is not a kind of contestation between nation states. No, we need a different kind of alliance altogether. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer to your question, but yeah.
Thank you so much to everyone who attended this event, either in person or online. Sadly, we have come to the end of our event today. It's past time, but I want to take a moment again to thank Dr. Madhulika Banerjee for her very informative and provocative, eye-opening talk, and for coming here all the way from India to share her knowledge. And with that, thank you, and hopefully you'll come to more IPS events in the future.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was fascinating.
Thank you.
It was fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you.